What I wanted to do today is really begin to talk about climate solutions and what we can do to move forward because, in the last few years, it feels like we're kind of stuck when it comes to addressing climate change. That we have so many issues facing us, we have so much to do, but we seem to be spinning our tires in the muck and not quite getting the traction we need to address the problem at hand. But this kind of feeling of being stuck doesn't have to be the case. We don't have to be stuck anymore. In fact, we can pivot really very clearly right now if we have a bold vision and we set out to go build a better world and find a roadmap to get there. And so this morning I'd like to share with you kind of some ideas of how we might build that roadmap together, of how to get unstuck and move to a place where we can address climate change and stop it before it gets to be a total calamity. To do that, we're going to talk about what we're calling the Drawdown Roadmap from the organization I represent called Project Drawdown, or drawdown.org if you want to find out a bit more. And hopefully we can kind of walk through this together. We're going to do 3 areas of focus, though, of building this roadmap to a better future. What would that look like? Well, first, we need some visionary science to guide the way. Because science is really why we're here in the first place. Because science first told us about the climate problem. It told us about this, by the way, a very, very long time ago. It turns out that the first person to write about climate change, the fact that CO2 in the atmosphere would warm the planet and destabilize it, wasn't the person I thought it was when I was in grad school. I was told it was a guy named Joseph Tyndall from Britain in the 19th century. Turns out it's not true. It was an American woman named Eunice Foote, F-O-O-T-E. Everybody should know her name because she discovered the idea of global warming in 1853. You heard me right, 1853. This is how long people have been ignoring scientists, okay, for a very long time. She wrote back then, years before Tyndall, in fact, decades before Arrhenius and others, that CO2 building up in the atmosphere would cause the planet to warm, and she was right. And we're now living in the world that she wrote about back then in the middle of the 19th century. So we do understand very well what's happening to the planet from climate change. And now we see a second chapter of climate science that started maybe in the last decade or so, thanks to the IPCC, to Project Drawdown, a few other organizations, that we do know that potential, at least theoretical, solutions do exist. In fact, the science can tell us what actually works and what doesn't. Because for a long time, we've heard competing claims about how to solve climate change. If you just go on Twitter right now, well, don't, wait a minute, okay? Go wait for the break, okay? But if you go on Twitter or Facebook or whatever, you can find on any given day a whole bunch of very confident people who know absolutely nothing about it, but who are confident in telling you they have the solution, capitalize the solution, to climate change. And this might be a few of them. Here are some examples you can pick off the web in any given day. But science can help us sort it out, to figure out which of these solutions actually works, how big they could be, how effective they might be, what they might cost. And Project Drawdown, among others, has been looking at this very carefully. These are, for example, some of the solutions to climate change we know will work. Whether it's in the electricity sector, these are different kinds of solutions we find today existing right now in electricity. The size of those little pies, if you will, slices are proportional to the amount of carbon that they would prevent. Or we could look over here in the food sector and see how preventing deforestation, reducing food waste, shifting our diets, and other things could be huge climate solutions. So science not only tells us about the problem, it's beginning to illustrate the possibility of solutions and what they might look like, from electricity to food to here in transportation and so on and so on. That's good. And the science can even go farther and tell us about the economics of climate solutions, at least in principle. This funny little chart here is called a Mckenzie style cost curve. What it shows is the cost of different climate solutions, from cheapest to the most expensive, stacked from left to right. The amazing thing here is that about 80% of the climate solutions we need to stop climate change actually make money right now without any sort of government support. That's pretty damn good. So we can invest $25 trillion and make back $125 trillion without any government support at all. That's a pretty good opportunity, don't you think? So here we have the evolution of climate science so far. Describe the problem at least illustrate the potential for solutions. But science needs to get into the trenches now. It's not enough to describe solutions. Science needs to be in the room where we deploy and scale solutions. We need to kind of get from describing theoretical ideas into the nitty-gritty of how we actually deploy them. Kind of the difference between physics describing a bridge and an engineer helping you actually build it. And that's what we need today. And how many people have seen this movie? The Martian, right? Okay, I love this movie. If you don't know it, Matt Damon is stranded on Mars, right? He gets stranded a lot in movies, don't you notice that? We spend a lot of money trying to save Matt Damon, it seems, in Hollywood. But he wrote that if you're stranded on Mars, and he's a scientist trying to figure out how to survive on Mars by himself, he writes, you just begin, you do the math, you solve one problem, you solve the next one, and then the next. But the best line in the entire movie, at least for me, is he says, you're gonna have to science the shit out of this. And that's true for climate change too. We're really gonna have to do some hard science and figure out how to solve the problem. Now, you all know the basics. We here are today that little red dot. Greenhouse gases are rising still to this day. And if we follow the recent history, we'd continue along that dotted line. That's not good. That's not what we want to do at all. That'll just make the problem worse. So what we have to do, of course, is cut emissions dramatically, very quickly, hopefully in the next decade or so, roughly 40, 50% if we want to stay on track to the Paris Accords, and then keep going. We need to stabilize those emissions, cut them, and keep cutting into the middle of the century. But it's doubtful we can eliminate all greenhouse gas emissions completely, even by mid-century. We're going to do our best, of course, but that's where the idea of some carbon removal might have to come in. That is, plants and soils, oceans, and machines could help maybe remove some of that CO2 that we put in the atmosphere and tuck it away somewhere safe that doesn't cause climate change. It's important to know, though, that carbon removal today is zero. It can't even be measured in the atmosphere. Despite all the attempts to do it, it's still about 1 million times too small to even be seen on this graph. So we have a lot of work to do to scale that up. But that's the idea of getting to net zero. We'll cut as much as we can and absorb a little bit just to kind of buy us some extra time. So that's what we have to do, get to net zero sometime by mid-century. That'll keep the planet from warming by maybe 1.5 to 2 degrees. That's now the target we're trying to be aiming for. So what does that mean? Well, to do that, we're gonna have to build a large portfolio of effort. We have to think about hundreds of different things we do to address climate change, and science can better guide us on building that portfolio. This portfolio could be money, how we allocate capital. It could be about effort, time, policy, everything. But right now, we're kind of in the Wild West where people are just doing lots of different things without much scientific guidance, and we need some. So let me walk you through a couple of ideas. What does science say we should do to allocate money and time and effort across all the sectors we have to look at? Well, here's one way to look at it. First is the value of time. A lot of you in this room are involved in maybe finance or investing, and you know about the time value of money. Well, there's a time value of carbon as well. Let me show you how that works. So as we try to approach net zero, here we are at that red dot. The first thing we have to do, of course, is cut emissions. That's what that little blue area is. But if we cut emissions this decade, it's the gift that keeps on giving. Because we can cut emissions by a bunch of gigatons per year now, this decade, and that'll keep happening in the 30s and 40s and into the 2050s as well. In fact, about 80% of what we need to do to stop climate change happens in the next 10 years. That's incredible because it just keeps paying off forever. It's 30 years of impact for 1 year's emissions cuts today. That's incredible. The emissions cuts we do in the 2030s, though, won't pay off as well because it has fewer years to be implemented. And then high-tech solutions that can only be turned on in the 2040s, unfortunately, only get to work in that little sliver at the end. This is one of the things we have to really grapple with. As much as we want to hear from technologists and visionaries about new technologies in the 2030s, 40s, and 50s, they have fewer years to work. It's not just how many gigatons per year you save, it's the number of years you can turn it on for. So yes, nuclear fusion could be great, but insulating attics works right now and can do stuff for 30 years, where some other technology might only have a few years to actually implement it. It's kind of like dieting. If you start today and do a little bit every day, it adds up. But you wait until the day before you get on the scale, it's a lot harder. So this kind of time value of carbon tells us why the 2020s are so much more important and why available technologies are always going to win over new technologies because they just simply have more time to operate. We'll need all of them, but time value of carbon trumps everything. That's also why carbon removal is always going to be a very small part of the equation. Mathematically, it's impossible if it's 0 today and can only scale to a few gigatons by 2050 to be much more than about 5% of the answer. So when we do the math and we do the whole sum here, we find that emissions cuts of the 2020s keep on paying off. We add a bit more in the 30s, we add a bit more in the 40s, and at the end of the day, what we find is cutting emissions is always about 94, 95% of the answer, and carbon removal is relatively small, and what we do in the 2020s trumps everything. So that's something we have to grapple with, and it's often forgotten. We also have to break down the economic sectors of where the carbon comes from. What we find is if we want to build an action portfolio to guide the future, about 87% of what we need to do is direct emissions cuts in these 6 economic sectors: electricity, food, industry, transport, energy processing, and buildings. Those are the 6 biggies. We can, in addition, find ways through efficiency and then decarbonization, many subcategories within those 6 areas where we can find many opportunities to reduce greenhouse gas burdens in the atmosphere. We'll go through a lot of those in a minute. But there's also indirect ways we can cut emissions, and that's through social interventions. Things that you don't do for climate, you do for people. But when you do them for people, they unleash a whole suite of additional climate solutions. At Project Drawdown, we've written a lot about how health and education investments for women and girls are, in fact, a climate solution. We also write about the fact that helping indigenous communities protect their own land, especially forest and land tenure, is also a climate solution. And we can actually give you the gigatons of carbon that those will save. So social interventions, kind of more indirect ways of lowering emissions, are also crucial, and they add up again to about 94% of what we have to do. And then we add carbon removal, which is another maybe 6%. And so here is the beginning of a portfolio design by science itself that tells us where we need to put our money, our time, and our effort. This is the atmosphere's portfolio. How does ours stack up? Well, we can also double click on this and get into more detail if you want. We can triple click on it and really nerd out if you want to later. But this shows you basically what we have to do. I want to give this graph to every single policymaker, every investor, every philanthropist, every journalist, every activist, and say, this is it. This is what the planet has told us we need to do between now and 2050. And until a couple of weeks ago, scientists had never made a graph like this. So this is something we need to do, is help design portfolios of activity and action and capital deployment. And here's one. So this is the world's carbon portfolio, what we actually need to do. How are we doing with our allocation of effort? Well, pretty good in some cases. Here's an estimate of where philanthropy and climate is going. We know that about 6 to 8, maybe closer to $10 billion a year now are coming from philanthropy into the climate space. A lot of that is going to support bigger efforts and larger enabling organizations, but some of it is going directly into solutions themselves, investing in these kinds of projects. This is an estimate of how that might be broken down thanks to ClimateWorks, who's done a really careful analysis of the foundations that report on their spending. And we see that solutions philanthropy around climate is doing a pretty good job. Maybe a little bit underinvested in industry. Philanthropists maybe don't want to give to big industries in solving their climate emissions, but okay. Maybe a little less to energy, but overall, pretty good. We also see where venture capital is putting its money right now in climate. And that's even a bigger pot of money. This is estimated to be about $87 billion last year. It's doing quite well in some ways. You can see a large investment, of course, in transportation. That makes complete sense right now because that's where the value proposition is in starting new companies. That's a great opportunity space this year. I don't know what venture will look like in 2 or 3 years from now, or how it may change in the future after that, but it needs to be a dynamic landscape as opportunities arise. So that makes a lot of sense at the moment too, as part of this portfolio of portfolios. But again, at the end of the day, we got to look at the atmosphere too and make sure they do add up and eventually add up to the total of what the atmosphere needs. And here's an estimate of what international multilateral institutions, development and organizations like the World Bank and IMF have committed to, and beyond traditional development assistance, specific climate funding itself on top of everything else. We're also doing an estimate now of what the Inflation Reduction Act will do on top of all this. One thing that's important for Americans in the audience, we're very happy now that after 30 years, the US Congress has finally started to act on climate. That's great. Took a little while. But also to recognize it's not the biggest pile of money in the room. The Inflation Reduction Act will be spending about $35 billion a year on climate solutions. The private sector and philanthropy is putting in about 150 already, and it didn't take them 30 years to do it. So let's kind of see the whole picture here. But the idea is we have a planetary portfolio, and we need to make sure ours eventually aligns to it, and that we put our effort where the carbon is. And I think we're beginning to do a pretty good job of that, but we can always do better. Another thing we have to do is not just align our effort around sectors, but across time. One of the things I stress a lot is the importance of time, the time value of carbon. And that's why we need emergency brake solutions right now to stop climate change. We talk a lot about infrastructure, we talk a lot about other things we have to do, but different climate solutions take different amounts of time to unfold into the future. Infrastructure is huge. We're gonna have to rebuild everything. Every internal combustion engine in the world needs to go away. Every power plant, every farm, every building, everything needs to be rebuilt, reimagined, and redeployed. In the meantime, we have to do some other things to stop climate change even faster. Things like fugitive methane emissions. Let's plug the leaks. We need to stop deforestation. We need to reduce food waste. We need to increase dramatically energy efficiency within the existing infrastructure because we can't wait for 10 years for the new infrastructure to replace it. We're gonna have to do everything, but a lot of what we need to do happens to happen fast. Then we do infrastructure. And of course, in parallel, we invest in health and education, in land tenure, in nature, in technology, recognizing we need it all, but each solution has its own kind of characteristic time scale on which it will unfold between now and mid-century. And we'll need to have a balanced portfolio across time as well as across sectors. This is critical, and I'd argue we're not doing nearly enough, not even remotely nearly enough, in the emergency brake solutions, those that can actually be measured in the atmosphere within 2 to 3 years from today. That's what we actually need, but we're not doing enough. The good news is we could, and there are a lot of opportunities. Another thing we have to do, of course, is not just allocate our efforts across sectors, across time, but also across geography, because there are lots of 80-20 rules in climate work. For example, if you look at this map, ask the question, if I gave you well, I don't have $1 billion, but if I had $1 billion to invest in renewable energy, where would you put it? Where the sun's shining, where the wind's blowing, where the people live, where the grids are? Yeah. But you'd also want to put it where the dirtiest power plants are so you can turn them off. This shows in the red, these are the most dirty power plants. About 70% of greenhouse gas emissions come from the 30% dirtiest power plants. Hey, we could do something about that. Or did you know that the 1% leakiest natural gas and oil wells in the country are releasing about 30% of the fugitive methane going into the atmosphere? 1% of the wells causes 30% of the pollution. I want to go find those 1% right now and bring a big wrench. Let's clean those things up today. So let's go find the hot spots of activity, whether it's looking at renewable energy systems or whether it's protecting rainforests. This map shows a laser LiDAR system from space measuring the biomass of trees on Earth. The red areas in the Amazon showing where the richest forests are from a carbon point of view. But then we can overlay maps of biodiversity and forests that indigenous communities are trying to protect and maybe find the best places to emphasize for rainforest protection here in the Amazon basin. So science can also guide us to kind of where we need to focus, not just when and how, but where we do it specifically. We also need science to help us maximize the co-benefits of climate solutions, because we don't want to just fix the sky and save a polar bear or something. We need to be thinking about human well-being. We need to be thinking about equity and justice, poverty and health and biodiversity, and so many other things that need to be solved simultaneously. Here's an analysis we did at Project Drawdown that looks at climate solutions in these kind of circles over here with gigatons of carbon. But then we also looked at the human benefits, especially to the most vulnerable peoples in the world in low and middle income countries. When we do a climate solution, does it help alleviate poverty? Does it improve education and health? Does it improve the status of women and girls? The good answer here is yes, they can. Climate solutions can in fact be solutions to some of our other problems if we do them wisely. And finally, not only do we look for benefits, we have to look at the barriers. A lot of the barriers to climate solutions are multidimensional. If we know we have these solutions to climate change and we want them to scale, we have to figure out what all the barriers are, not just the ones that are in front of us, depending on where we sit. If I go to DC, a lot of people might say the barriers to climate change are policy. Well, they're not wrong. But if I go to Silicon Valley, you might hear a lot more about technology, or go to Wall Street, you might hear more about capital. Talk to scientists, we'll say it's about science. Talk to business leaders, they'll say it's the business models don't work. You know what? They're all right, and they're all wrong. We need to look at all of these different gaps and make sure when we invest in solving one of them, we don't ignore the others, especially culture and behavior. Those are so often overlooked, and that's often the stumbling point of getting things right. How do we solve for all of these at the same time? Again, I think a very careful analysis of the how we implement climate solutions can help address these problems. So more than though just the science roadmap of how we deploy climate solutions, we also need to look at where leadership can be effective. Now again, I mentioned already today that we have, for decades, been relying mainly on governments or the UN to address climate change. Well, how's that going so far? Okay, but not great. It's been a little slow. I'll just be generous and say that. And I think we have to look for other ways to deploy leadership, because it took 30 years for this country, for example, to kind of get off its act and begin to deploy some resources to climate solutions. Thankfully, that's happening, but 30 years is an awful long time to wait, and it costs the planet dearly. So we need to do some other things and find other big movers and make big moves. During the last 30 years, it was kind of interesting. In 1997, the US Senate voted 97-0 to vote against the Kyoto Protocols. You remember that? Guess what? The US beat the Kyoto Protocols anyway. In 2009, the US Senate voted down the Waxman-Markey bill, the cap and trade bill. Environmentalists said it would be a disaster, it would cost the planet dearly. We still beat the goals of the cap and trade bill anyway, even though it never became law. Why did that happen? It happened mainly because of business, technology, and investing, and culture, and activism. Politicians were late to the game, other people stood up. We see business leadership, we're going to see a lot more of it later today, where business leaders are stepping up and doing more than just making promises. They're implementing great solutions about reducing emissions, engaging stakeholders, redeploying capital, using their political voice, and more. We need a lot more of this leadership. It's not enough, but it's a very good start. And we should grow that leadership because it's been instrumental in some of the things we've seen so far. Philanthropy has stood up. Again, billions and billions of dollars are going into climate solutions. We need more of it, but it's beginning to make a real difference. We're also seeing investors and technologists and venture capital and other kinds of actors putting their money where their mouth is and investing in incredible solutions like solar, like wind, like batteries, like LED lighting, and now heat pumps and electric vehicles. These are all hitting tipping points where they're beating fossil fuels in the market and changing the world. And that's largely thanks to the role of investors and technology and other things have helped a lot. This is one of the things we want to harness at Drawdown, for example, is how do we bring together philanthropists and investors alongside government, alongside activists and everyone else to best deploy these resources guided by the best science to be the most effective possible into the future. So that's something we're going to be looking at later this fall, and I hope some of you will come talk to us about that later today. Finally, besides a visionary science, besides enabling a broader spectrum of leadership, besides just government alone, but all of it, we also need to kind of rethink the messaging around climate change and how we talk about it. Because, my God, this is what climate change kind of feels like right now. It's insanely stressful. And there's a good reason, because there's a lot of terrible stuff happening in the world. The planet is changing. It is getting seriously bad out there in a lot of ways. But we also have to recognize, on top of the reality of climate change and how bad it is, that bad is being amplified by a business model in media that only talks about bad news. We're only hearing 99% of the coverage in the media about climate change is about the disasters. Less than 1% is about the solutions. But that's not the actual world we live on. Most climate scientists will tell you, yes, the bad news is about this big, but the solutions are about this big. And maybe it needs to be a bit more balanced. And we also need to realize that we've broken through already. 90 to 92% of Americans now believe climate change is real. We've won. That's about the same number that believe the Earth is round, okay? I'm serious, that's true. So, I think we're good. I'm not worried about the other 8%. We're never gonna get them. It's fine. So, and you know them because they come to Thanksgiving, right? Yeah. So 90 to 92% believe it's real. About 60% of Americans are alarmed or concerned about climate change, kind of freaked out about it, thanks to the news, and it's finally broke through. That's good, I guess. But it's not motivating action because it's just scaring the hell out of people. We have climate anxiety. We have people being fearful and disengaged. Just at the moment we need them to be super engaged, they're getting disengaged. This is not how we're going to help motivate action in some ways. Alarming people is one thing, inspiring them is another, and we need to do a little bit of both. The problem here is even though 60% of Americans are freaked out about climate change, only about 1 to 2% of them list it as a top issue facing them and that they could do something about in any Gallup poll ever taken. So we need to figure out how to reboot the climate conversation and talk much more about solutions, not just the problems. We also have to meet people where they are. Even though people are worried about climate change, it's never in the top 5 issues facing the American public, ever. You know what it is? Jobs, health, security, equity, justice, communities, things like that, kitchen table issues. That's great, because you know what? Climate solutions are awesome for these things. Climate solutions are job solutions, they're health solutions, they're security solutions, they're equity solutions. So why don't we meet people where they are? Instead of trying to turn all Americans into Greta Thunberg or whatever, why don't we go to them and say, how can we help you with your concerns, instead of trying to make everyone a climate activist? And when we meet people where they are and talk about their most important concerns and listen, we can be much more effective. My mom used to tell me, you're born with 2 ears and 1 mouth. Try to use them in that ratio. I struggle with that. But we all could do a better job of listening to everyday Americans' concerns and meeting people where they are, and I think we could be far more effective with new messages and new messengers who are more relatable, more diverse. We don't need more middle-aged white guys like me always being the face of climate change. We have to do a better job of getting to communities, meeting people where they are with the concerns they have, and more relatable, more authentic, more diverse messengers. All of that is so critical. And at the end of the day, I'll just wrap up here. We don't only have to reimagine the world ahead of us. Of course we do. It's an urgent challenge. We have to do better. But I look at this and say, wait a minute, no. We get to reimagine the world. This is an opportunity. Martin Luther King didn't go around the country telling people, I have a nightmare. He said, I have a dream. It's a dream. He died for that dream, and we're not fulfilling it completely yet, but we're on a course that he helped inspire. What if we dreamed of a better future for us and our children, where we do address climate change, where we make a more verdant and just and peaceful world, a world that is equitable and sustainable and thriving? And we can find our way there. I'm convinced of it. We can find a way from the world that is, which is kind of out of control, to the world that could be, It's just right there, just in front of us, and we could almost touch it. I always think about this, the thousands of generations of people before us who struggled so hard so that we could live a little bit better life today. And right in front of us, right there, is the world that could fulfill the promise of all those generations that we could seize and make a reality for the people who will be here today and all those that come after us. And that reality is just in our reach, and it's just something in front of us. But we'll only get there if we remember this. The future's up to you. It's up to all of us, and it's within reach. But it belongs to people who will take the risk and accept the responsibility of creating that conscious future, the future that we want. So with that, thank you very much for your time today, and look forward to seeing you the rest of the next summit. Thank you so much.